Hey everyone. So today I'm going to be covering the round 8 game between Richard Rapport and Jan-Krzysztof Duda. So I chose not to cover the Nakamura game because Nakamura had a really nice analysis of his own game on his own channel. So I just felt like maybe we should look at the other decisive game in the round. So the game's Rapport is playing white, Duda is playing black. So the game started with one e4, e5. Let me just click that real quick. Knight f3, knight f6, basically indicating that Duda was ready to go into a Petrov, which would start with knight takes pawn. Instead, we had this move knight c3, and this enters the four knights variation. Usually, you don't see this in the top tournaments, or at least I don't really see this. It has been played. It's been played by a bunch of the top guys like Nakamura, Carlsen, MVL, Caruana. I mean, lots of people play this stuff, but it's just not something that's considered to be a challenge for black. So, and Rapport comes up with this move, g3. It's not really his move, actually. I think I've seen a lot of games with Daniel Naroditsky playing this move, g3. And the idea is that you're just going to put the bishop here, castle, and just keep playing the game as usual. Usually, white in this position plays either bishop b5, bishop c4, or d4, which can transpose into like a sort of like a Scotch game. So instead g3 and bishop c5, very logical. It just looks at the f2 square. The bishop is also placed on a good diagonal. So bishop g2, d6, very logical. d3, and now a5. Castles and h6. H6 just to prevent bishop g5. I'm not really sure why bishop g5, for example, wasn't played here. Maybe it's because h6 anyways, and this can be taken. With the inclusion of g3, this pin is not that scary because g5 is possible and the bishop would be trapped on h4. So that's why you would have to take here. But this didn't happen, so instead castles and now h6, just preventing bishop g5 at all. And now b3. So if the bishop can't come out on this diagonal, I think Rapport intended it to come out on this one. Not really sure what that really does. I mean, it's going to be hard for white to break with d4, so I don't know if bishop b2 is really on the cards. Maybe this move was more intended to prevent something with a4. So b3, castle's very logical, and now h3, another seemingly weird pawn move. It does intend to stop bishop g4. So knight d4 happened. Bishop e3, and now c6. And black intends to at some point play either d5, b5, or even both, and just try to basically gain a lot of space. This is a very common plan for black in these type of positions. And so king h2, another pretty strange move to me. Now, white doesn't really want to exchange here. Because after this, black has this move d5, and yes, white has e5, but after something like knight d7, knight takes. It's not really clear. Black is actually a bit better because these pawns look a little strange. The c2 pawn might become a weakness, and there are a lot of dark square weaknesses as well. So it's just like a Swiss cheese position on the queen side where, exchanging off this bishop has proven to be a problem because black has a really strong dark square bishop now. So that's not really ideal. So I think that's why something like king h2 was played, just to preempt bishop e6, queen d7. I've done this myself in a lot of games, so it makes sense. Rook e8, very logical. Just defending the e-pawn so that d5 is a bit stronger. And now a3. Again, this move, I really don't fully understand what the intent of it is. Maybe in some positions, black would like to play bishop a3, bishop b2. But I wasn't sure if it was really that much of a threat in that position specifically. And black here has a few decisions to make. So what does black really do? Well, d5 is not really working because after e takes d5, e takes d5. Now this is different. Not bishop takes, I'm sorry, pawn takes. You don't want to exchange off the dark squared bishops. This is a bit different because now white has some pressure on this pawn, and the structure is really not ideal for black. So d5 is really not something black would try to play right now. The other move I was thinking of was maybe b5. I didn't really see anything wrong with this. I think it looks really reasonable to me. I guess the one thing that black does have to worry about is that the c6 pawn is a little bit weak, which would make d5 a little bit harder to play. But I just thought that this was a very logical way to play. The game can go like this, for example, and this is a little bit different because in this case, yes, this pawn is under attack, but if this is taken, for example, this is taken, and again, these dark squares are actually really weak. So I think this is fine for black. So yeah, I thought that might have been an interesting way to play. Or, sorry, after a3, knight takes was played, but I was also thinking maybe, like, why not something like queen c7, just keep everything together. And if queen d2, just d5 now, and that's a bit different. Because if this is all exchanged, queen b6. But I'm pretty sure Duda saw this and just didn't like the fact that he had to hold this pawn with the bishop and the queen. So I understand why he didn't play this, especially because this bishop can't come to g4 to remove this knight. So I completely understand. It makes a lot of sense, and it's actually not clear what black is going to do next. Maybe bishop d7, something like that, maybe like this move in the future, although that's not going to be possible with b4 coming. So instead of that, Duda decided to just exchange everything on everything, literally. He exchanged on f3, and then he took on e3. And now f takes. The computer doesn't like this. It thinks queen takes is better. But for a human being, playing queen takes and then looking at d5 is a really annoying move to me because the rook is across the queen. That's one thing. The other thing is black has achieved this great center expanse with d5, and d4 is threatened, so you have to move the queen again. If something like queen d2, then bishop e6, and black just has very easy development here. Black has no problems. Because white removed his dark squared bishop, the danger on the king side is a lot smaller. Although Rapport does prove me wrong. So instead f takes, and now b5. Again, very logical. Black has this big space advantage on the queen side. And the idea is to at some point maybe break with a4, b4, maybe d5 whenever the time is right. And white has to think about how he's going to proceed here. Rapport found a really good move. G4. I really like this. It's not he's not an engine, but this is a great move because he has to create some sort of problems on the king side. If he can't, he's going to get completely swarmed in the queen side and the center. Because black just needs to get in d5 or break something on the queen side, and white's queen side structure is actually pretty weak. The a3 pawn might be weak. The c2 pawn is definitely a weakness. So it's kind of like white has to rush things or else he's going to get completely destroyed. So a great move by Duda here, rook a7. I really like this move. The rook needs to get into the game, and this is the best way to do it. Every other piece is actually well placed. This bishop is well placed. It could come out on this diagonal, but it's fine here for now. And for the rook to join the game, for the rook to join the center, let's say, it's going to take it a couple moves, like bishop b7, move the queen, move the rook. Instead, rook a7 does that in one go, because now the rook can just join the center and influence the position very quickly. This is also a really good defender of the king side, as we'll see in a moment. You have to excuse my sinuses. I'm having allergies or something. So rook a7. Now, queen g3. I really like this move as well. Just basically trying to force through g5 at some point and leaving the f-file for the rooks. So what white really wants to do here is, if I could give white a bunch of moves, is to play rook f2, rook f1, maybe knight e2, maybe move the queen somewhere, get the knight into f5 somehow, and just start pushing. And this is the ideal setup for white. So h5 was played, and here I honestly thought for a second that maybe he should have considered something else, because h5 it feels like a mistake to me. But I think after, if we look at a move like d5, this doesn't really work. Because after e takes, knight e4 is a really strong move. And suddenly it looks like the knight can hop in here. This is a lot stronger. Knight f6 might be a tactic at some point. This c-pawn might move, and it won't be a weakness anymore. So d5 is not working. So what else can be played? If we want to prepare d5, I was honestly looking at rook c7. I really like this move because now if d5 comes and this is taken, the rook is going to hit the c2 pawn. So white should follow up with like rook f2 just to cover that pawn. Now d5, of course, is not going to be a problem. One other thing with d5. The reason d5 is actually pretty weak is because this b5 square is weak. So once the c pawn takes, the knight can just take b5. In this case, the rook is on c7 and it was attacking c2. But again, since white has to play rook f2 to cover it, d5 is once again not a thing. Black can just proceed with like knight h7, try to bring the knight around, just defend his g5 square, try to bring the queen in, maybe bring in the rook via e6. For example, like rook af1, rook e6 is a good move just to bring it into g6 and just start defending the king side. And it's actually white who's going to have permanent weaknesses because he played g4 and h3. On the other hand, black is actually pretty secure. He has a lot of pieces. The rook is an excellent defender of the 7th rank. So it's not really clear how white is supposed to go forward. If he pushes too hard, he's going to wreck his own king side. Like for example, after d4, black has this great move, queen e8, just to pressure this e3 pawn and just hold the center. And this is just a great move. I mean, black is very solid here. He doesn't have to actually be worried about anything. So instead of that, h5 was played. Now, I think after g5, he pushed with h4 here. But I think after knight h7, which is the top engine line, he was probably worried about h4, because now it looks like this knight is really trapped, and it doesn't look like it can get out easily. So for example, like g6, just to prevent g6 itself from coming, which might be annoying, g6 is played to give the king some more room and, just to block this pawn. Now rook f2, like this looks very logical, rook f8, rook f1. And it looks like white has a pretty good attack going here. But I think Duda just kind of underestimated how good f6 is here. Maybe he was afraid after something like queen g6. But queen g6 is actually not good because what happens is, for example, you could just play rook g7 here and suddenly it's white who's having issues. This pawn is weak. This king is actually completely packed with pieces. This king, on the other hand, like, yes, he has rooks. He has 2 rooks and a bishop around him, but this queen is targeting this pawn. This knight has a good square to land on. The bishop is coming into the game. It's just a disaster for white. So this is not actually going to work. After takes, he has to play something else. He can't take on g6. And that's when white would start thinking here, what is he going to do? Because this knight is actually also pretty useless. This knight is active. And that's the problem for, I think, white, is that these minor pieces aren't actually doing much, but black's minor pieces are excellent. They have this g4 square available to them. So instead of that, he played here h4, which I didn't fully agree with. I think this is just not a great idea. Because yes, you do win the pawn, but now you open up the files here, and in a way, this is really not like my fault for the clicking. So knight h7 was played, and this is a little bit different. Bishop h3, and this is a great move. It's not to exchange bishops, it's just to quickly get on the g-file. Like, this is awesome. Rook g1, you just leave this bishop hanging, just threaten mate. Really active play from Rapport. And knight g5 here. I'm not honestly sure what's wrong with something like g6, just give this up. Because if king takes, for example, now knight f6 is fine, and this is actually a decent blockade. King g7 might be coming, maybe not at the moment, but maybe at some point, maybe the rooks can switch. I mean, this rook is, again, an excellent defender, and black's king is actually okay. White's king is the one who has to worry about things. So yeah, I'm not sure why this wasn't played. So here, if something like, for example, if something like f6, then, you could just play queen takes, and this is actually bad. You shouldn't do this, because you actually did create a weakness on g6. So that is why, I mean, he played here knight g5, and I guess the idea was to close off the g-file and save his bishop. But the problem is it does actually leave the h-file open, and the other thing is that this pawn is actually quite useful for white. Even though it blocks the g-file, it is actually a little bit useful for for white like to build his position behind this pawn. It's actually a good cover for the king as well. The queen can't enter the game. Excuse me. Well, I'll take a moment to just wipe my nose. These allergies are crazy. Okay. So rook g2 was played. Looks logical. I think he was trying to play rook h1 and just start building things up here. He could have even tried to play something like rook h1 here, and this is also it's okay. But okay, rook g2. The idea is, again, rook h1, queen h4, very straightforward. And now rook ae7. And I think here, I think black underestimated how strong white's attack could be. This h-file is actually very useful, and black can't really utilize it. So for example, if g6, you could just play here queen h4, and king g7 is not going to happen because queen h6, and then rook h1, and suddenly it's just disaster. And that's why basically black can't play king g7, rook h8. He has no time for that. So that's how this pawn is very useful. It's covering a lot of these dark squares. So he has to think of some other plan here. The computer suggests something like f6, which looks so wrong. I mean, first of all, if you take, okay, that's not the idea, but if you take, then this is actually okay because the queen comes into the game and the rook is still defending this pawn, and this rook might hop around, the king might escape. It's not clear. So you don't take this, but you just play g6, and this king looks really, really like it's shaky. It's really not clear. I mean, the h-file is still accessible for black, and the computer just wants to make a run for it with king f8, and just try to run and get the king to safety somewhere over here. But white has a lot of options. I mean, white can even play d4 here, I think, and after something like takes, you could just take, and I mean, this is a great center. And now, I mean, it's complicated, but basically, I think that white is still doing okay here. So that's really not what black wants to do. I don't think he wants to play f6. So instead he played rook ae7, which I understand the idea of it. It was just to pack the pawn, maybe at some point get d5 in, but I think this is just a bit too slow. It's not really working out for him. So queen f3 here. I like this move. Just basically trying to get here and play rook h1. It also looks at f7. And in a way, it does allow the rook to get behind the pawn. It's a logical move. Now g6, and I think that again, this is not really a great move. Now Rapport here had a win apparently, which is just queen h4, just getting on the h-file immediately. And after something like rook e6, I think you could just play. I mean, the computer suggests queen h5, which is really hard to see. I don't blame him for not seeing that. Inducing g6, because then the rook looks dumb and the h-file is still open and the queen gets all these dark squares. So you have to play something else. If you try rook g6, I think you could just play rook h1, and white should be winning here. But apparently the computer doesn't agree with me. The computer thinks rook f1 is the way to go. It's not very clear. I mean, I guess you do want to pile up on the f-file. But anyways, it's not easy to see that. So you played queen f3 here, which induces g6 anyways. And again, the computer suggests f6, and this is so crazy. I mean, you have to see that after takes, rook f7 is a move. And then you could, I mean, but look at the black king. This is like ridiculous. I don't think that anyone in their right mind would look at this and be like, oh, I guess I'm okay here. This looks really, really dangerous. And if something like queen takes and you exchange all the pieces, well, now the rook enters the 7th rank, and he can go behind these pawns here at some point. The knight can reroute into the game. These rooks are really active, and this king is actually pretty exposed. So I really don't think anyone in their right mind would play f6 here. Instead, he played g6. But this is a fatal mistake because he just weakened all his squares here, and this pawn can never really move forward because so the rook can defend. But this pawn can't move forward because white will just exploit those weaknesses very quickly. I mean, it happened anyway. So after rook h1, a very logical move, just taking over the h-file, f5 happened. But this isn't good because black is completely is too weak to fight here. If takes, then yes, this is actually okay because rook h7 is a thing. and then you could take on h1. And that's a little bit different. This is actually okay. Yeah, so this is threatened, so you could just play king f7, and I think black is okay here. It looks really scary, but black is okay. If something like rook f2, rook h8 comes, and actually, it's not so clear. It's really not so clear. You can go here, but then, I mean, the rook comes here, and this bishop and rook are working together. It's annoying. So that is why he didn't take. Instead, he just played king g1, avoiding all these checks and all this nonsense. The rooks look excellent now. So does the queen. And here, black played b4, and this was just completely ignored. E takes f5, what a move. If pawn takes knight, then f takes g6, and there's really no good way of stopping something like, for example, let's say black plays some normal move here, I don't know, d5. You just play queen h5, and this is just going to lead to mate. This is absolutely disgusting to defend. If something like rook g7, again, I think just queen h5 is mating. So that's not really working. So you can't take the knight. It's not a free knight. G takes f5. Now this great move, this final killer move, knight e4. Again, if this is taken, queen h5 is just completely crushing. There's no defense here. Rook g7 runs into... you could play g6 here, and I think that wins. Queen h8 also wins, but I think g6 is just a lot cleaner because it covers all these squares, and you can't stop queen h8. If you try to run queen h8 anyways, king e7, you just win the rook. So that's not really working. Oh, mate. So that's not working, and that's why here Duda resigned. But what a game! Honestly, it wasn't clear how white was going to break through until black made some fatal errors here. But a really good game. So to just start off, I mean, first of all, the opening was very weird with g3 and then, you know, trying b3. I mean, this is Rapport we're talking about, so he's a very... He plays all the sidelines and never touches main lines because it's not his style. I think this is just... He could get a position that is, like, objectively, like, opening-wise, like, worse for him, and he will play it for no reason. That's just who he is. And I mean, like, he had a pretty decent way of playing. I mean, also taking here and exchanging everything, it looks good, but I think, like, you know, as a kid, when I was in chess school or whatever, when you get this open file in these sort of positions, it's just a very fun way to play for white. It's black who has to put in some work to defend. White can just play natural moves like rook f2, rook f1, g4, knight e2, and just start swarming. Black, on the other hand, if he wants to keep his advantage, he has to play very accurately. So, yeah, I mean, what can I really say? This move g4, great way to create problems. And Duda did play well until, like, he just made some errors. Like, h5 was just not necessary, I think. And then playing h4 was also, like, not necessary. I don't know why he didn't just retreat the knight and keep everything closed. I think keeping this closed would have kept his king safe. Yeah, h4 just, like, allowed white to basically just get this edge, this really annoying edge. And then this weird move, knight g5, I mean, why not play g6, you know? Just hold everything together. h5 is not working here, by the way. Just to clear that up. If bishop c8, if you take this, no problem, because rook g7 is coming. And this king is actually really safe, and there are no pieces on the h-file to attack. Or this rook is still not in the game. This rook will come into the game very quickly. This queen will come into the game very quickly. This rook will come into the game very quickly. And white is screwed here. So that's why I don't know what Duda was afraid of with g6. And, you know, taking this, I mean, this does disrupt the communication between white's pieces. So I don't know if this was really a massive threat. If something like this, then you just play rook h8. Maybe that's what he didn't see. If you play h6, you close everything down. If you take, then knight g5 just wins instantly. So I don't know what Duda was afraid of here when he didn't play g6. But yeah, knight g5, I mean, maybe he underestimated just how strong his pawn is and how weak his open h-file is. And then playing g6 here, like, was just it just sealed the deal for Rapport. A really good game, a very nice conversion, nice little tricks here, and a great finisher. What can I say? So the standings, I'll get to the standings in the next video, but I believe Nepo's still leading, and I will cover the video between, I will cover the games, or one of the games from today. There were 3 decisive games in round 9, and Nepo is still in the lead. So thank you so much for watching. Feel free to leave any feedback, comments, anything at all. I do this because I like doing this. So yeah, thank you so much. Bye.